Thank you, Alex. Whether by writing or printing, the transfer of a text from one physical object to another by means of an intervening human hand and eye inevitably produces at some time or other copying errors. The study of such errors, excuse me, I have my wrong glasses on. The study of such errors is in the daily diet of those paleographers, bibliographers, textual critics who study the transmission of text. For a single error may be, in fact almost always is, more revealing of human processes than a long and wearying collation of unvaryingly accurate sequences of words. We may think of these as pleasant or pretty or even delightful errors. They instruct us. Such incidents or expected incidents that did not happen, like dogs not barking in the night, awaken the Holmesian chambers of our minds. In 1710, the scholar Ludolf Küster re-edited and enlarged the 1707 Greek New Testament with variant readings of John Mill, who died very shortly after his magnum opus was completed. Küster, a correspondent of Bentley, had been one of the editors of the Cambridge edition of the Byzantine encyclopedia called Suidas, or Suda. In reworking Mill's edition, the tireless Küster found what he called a lepidus error, a pretty mistake. In an appendix, Mill had printed a phrase from the Birds of Aristophanes as a variant reading of Luke 16, verse 3. The error must have arisen through some confusion in Mill's notes, for his edition includes a large number of indirect parallel passages from Greek sources, and this is where the Aristophanes lemma obviously belonged. But yes, errors can indeed be pretty. Of the errors we have seen so far, undoubtedly the prettiest is the one where the compositor of the 36-line Bible at 4 Ezra chapter 2 set text directly from the unrubricated line of the Gutenberg Bible, thereby proving in just 3 mispositioned words that the Gutenberg Bible was his exemplar. Another pretty but considerably more complex error in the 1462 Bible of Fürstenschuffer, or rather a pretty error in some copies of that edition, is this one, slide 2 please. From leaf 74 recto of the first volume, this is the paper copy at the Library of Congress, bequest of Lessing Rosenwald. The text of this column, if you look at line 3, the text of this column, the first 3 words of line 3, et lapidum argentum, is Deuteronomy 29:17. The 4th word and after of line 3, Moses at Joshua, etc., is Deuteronomy 31, verse 14, and so the remainder of the column continues. Thus, the compositor jumped over some 48 verses in a single line of his composing stick. But this error is not in all copies. In the Bodleian copy, also on paper, could we see slide 3, please? The words of Deuteronomy 29:17 continue correctly. Instead of Moses, we have et aurum quae collebant. They're idols of wood and stone, silver and gold, which they worshipped. And then on the next slide, we see the 2 of them, the one above the other. Library of Congress on top, Bodley below. The error is immediately explained when we examine the Gutenberg Bible and visualize the Fürstenschuffer compositor standing with it before him and copying it. He came to the end of the verso of one leaf of the Bible and set its last 3 words on what would become line 3 of column B of the page he was creating, at lapidum argentum. This was leaf 98 verso of the Gutenberg Bible. He then continued setting with the recto of the next page, but the next page in front of him was not 99 recto, as it ought to have been, but rather 100 recto, starting with the words Moises et Joshua, in the midst of Deuteronomy chapter 31. So leaf 99 was skipped over entirely. As for leaf 74 of the Bodley copy, it is a corrected cancel leaf, set after the original error of a skipped or misplaced leaf in the exemplar was discovered. So there's a difference in time between Leaf 74 Recto Bodley and Leaf 74 Recto Library of Congress. This is the boiled down, simplified explanation of an unusually complicated accident. The Fürstenschiffer compositor did not himself mistakenly skip over a leaf of his exemplar. Rather, that leaf he missed was a singleton, an inserted leaf, and it was placed in the wrong position in the copy of the Gutenberg Bible he had in front of him. It was placed after rather than before leaf 100. From an examination of 25 copies, including 2 single waste leaves preserved in Paris, it is possible to reconstruct the entire sequence by which, in Fürstenschiffer's shop, the original accident was made, discovered, and gradually corrected with a couple of missteps along the way over the course of composing 4 pages, 74 recto in verso and 75 recto in verso. Of each page, 3 different settings are recorded, making 12 page settings in all. Of one of the 3 settings of 74 verso, there are 2 chronologically distinct states. And of one of the 3 settings of the last page, 75 verso, there are 3 chronologically distinct states. So among these 25 copies, there are 8 different combinations of settings over 4 pages. We are reminded again of that fundamental distinction between a copy of an edition, a particular sample of sheets, and the edition itself, which is notional, but once existed in all the sheets that were printed from which complete copies could be made up. Some of those sheets being printed 2 or 3 years after other sheets of the same edition. Of the early Bibles set from copies of the Gutenberg Bible, the 1462 Bible was by far the most important in its textual influence. Like all the other early Latin Bibles, leaving aside the experiment of the Krakow proof leaf using imperial paper, it was a royal folio, but in several respects it was considerably more ambitious in conception than the others we have mentioned, the Mentalinen 36-line Bibles and the 3 editions of Heinrich Eggestein in Strasbourg. The total edition run must have been significantly greater than that of the Gutenberg Bible, and more copies were printed on vellum than on paper. There is no complete census, but of 82 pinned-down copies that can be counted, 32 are paper and 50 are vellum. Thus, it is likely that roughly 3/5 of the edition was offered on the significantly more expensive vellum, and 2/5 on paper. It may be recalled that other productions of the Fürstenschiffer shop, the 1457 and 1459 Psalters, the 1459 Durandus, the 1460 Constitutiones of Pope Clement V, were printed entirely on vellum. The firm had experience and success in selling expensive books. Unlike the other Bibles of the early group that left spaces for rubricators to supply book and prologue tituli, chapter initials, and chapter numbers, the 1462 Bible printed these in red, and in certain sections, the chapter initials and numbers alternated between red and blue from one chapter to the next, but this is highly variable. The early quires of the Bible left spaces for chapter numbers, but then numbers began to be printed, slide 6 please, not by setting individual characters of X, V, I from the typecase, but rather by making in advance small cast blocks with the full number in Lombard characters on the block, so that, say, chapter number 18 is a single block containing X, V, I, all on the same piece of metal. Like the other editions, composition was divided into 4 main composition units. Could we see slide 7, please? I'm sorry, this is handwritten. I just somehow couldn't do it any other way, and with a little bit of highlighter. The highlighter, if you can see it, means these are the quires of the book, of which, I investigated this, spent so much time on this, of which there are duplicate settings. So there are two settings of each of those choirs that's in yellow. And the 4 composition units, as in all the other early printed Bibles. Variations in printing the Bible, such as the incomplete experiment with blue printing along with red, are all to be studied by coordinating the composition units, because in each of the composition units, they show up for the first time at roughly the same time in the course of production, because the compositors were working at a pretty steady pace. Although our concentration is on the text of the 1462 Bible, this diagram of the composition units brings up 2 topics that should be mentioned briefly. First, as I just mentioned, there are 6 choirs that are recorded in duplicate settings. I would define them in detail in another publication and will not repeat here, except to point out they come at the end of their respective composition units. Thus, they are quite unlike the duplicate settings of the Gutenberg Bible and, to a lesser degree, the 36-line Bible, where the resettings were made to print additional pages in response to a decision to increase the edition run. In the Fuest and Schiffer shop, with the duplicate settings coming near the end of production, our picture has to be that 2 compositors were setting essentially identical pages, more or less side by side, each with a copy, or unbound choirs of a copy, of the Gutenberg Bible to set from. And presumably, the respective duplicate type pages were sent to different presses, but we don't really know that. Several years after these duplicate settings of choirs at the end of the 1462 Bible were identified and published, Mayumi Ikeda studied 2 paper copies of the Gutenberg Bible, one at the Morgan Library, containing the Old Testament only, and one at the Biblioteca Provinciale of Burgos. The copies had been illuminated to closely similar patterns by a Mainz artist shop known as the Fuestmaster. Dr. Ikeda discovered that in both copies, there were scattered marginal hash marks and vertical strokes within lines marking page endings of the 1462 Bible. And these compositors' marks were concentrated at the end of production, that is in Psalms and in 2nd Maccabees, where in fact there is duplicate setting. None of these pages, however, contains any marked emendations, unlike the Cambridge Bible. Thus, at the time the 1462 Bible was being produced, there remained at least 2 sets of sheets of the Gutenberg Bible still in the shop, unsold. And just as with the Gutenberg Bible at Cambridge, when it was in Heinrich Eggestein's shop in Strasbourg, after these sheets had finished being handled by Fuest and Schiffer's compositors, they were bound up and sold as viable copies. The sheets making up the Morgan Library Old Testament, in fact, were a little short of a full copy. 22 pages were missing. Some full sheets had been depleted, had already been sold, and there were no more in the shop. And in 2 cases, there was a sheet that had 3 of its 4 pages printing, but a 4th page had by mistake never gone under the press. All these pages had to be uniquely reset and printed off to make a copy textually complete and therefore saleable. As was pointed out nearly 60 years ago by 2 people I'm happy to remember as old friends, William H. Scheide and his then librarian, Mine O'Brien, a small, easily overlooked layout error in the Gutenberg Bible proves to be remarkably powerful in outlining the first draft, so to speak, of the descent of Latin Bible printing from the Gutenberg Bible to the end of the 15th century. This too qualifies in my mind as a delightful error, a happy error, in large part because it is so minor. There is no textual error at all, only an absence of white space in one place. In setting the Gospel of Matthew, the compositor, whether by oversight or a flaw in the exemplar, did not set a 2-line initial space for chapter 22. Could we see slide 8? This was noticed in the printing shop before all the sheets had gone out. And the Munich copy, but not the Vienna copy of the printed rubrication guide has a handwritten annotation, you see in the lower margin on the left, instructing how to correct this error. And next slide is a close-up of that instruction. And it tells you a red paragraph mark was to be inserted before the chapter's first words, et respondens Jesus, dixit iterum in parabolis, etc., and the number XXII was to be added in the margin. Slide 10, please. This instruction was carried out accurately by the rubricators of a considerable number of copies, such as that at the Bodleian Library, which you see here. Although no rubrication guides accompany any of these copies, we may presume that originally they had such guides with the same manuscript annotation we find on the Munich Tabula Rubricarum. At least 14 copies of the Gutenberg Bible marked Matthew 22 in the manner prescribed by the Munich copy, and that you see here. 8 copies, slide 11 please, made no chapter division at this place. Their copies of the Tabula Rubricarum may have been copies issued before the mistake was discovered and the annotation was added for correcting. And then 8 copies, slide 12, including the Munich copy and the National Library of Scotland copy, had a different place for chapter 22. They started at one verse later. Today it's Matthew 22, verse 2, beginning, simile factum est regnum caeli, to a king who prepares a wedding feast for his son. The Munich copy, in fact, though it preserves the Tabula Rubricarum, did not follow it anywhere in any of its rubrics. The same is true of other copies marking chapter 22 at simile factum est, such as the copies at Stuttgart, Yale, Humanities Research, and National Library of Scotland. The rubrications are independent of the printed guide. It matters little whether Matthew 22 is marked at, and Jesus replied and spoke again in parables, or at the parable, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a marriage feast for his son. It is just a matter of tradition. Oddly, the 2 13th century guides to Paris chaptering, or Langton chaptering as they called it, mentioned in an earlier lecture, differ here. The guide in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Latin 14417, marks it at 22:1 et respondens Jesus. Can we see the slide 13, please? And the guide here in Oxford at Magdalen, Latin 168, marks it at 22:2, simile factum est. And just pause for a minute to see if you can spot the red 22 and then go over to the left, simile factum est regnum caelorum. One of the so-called crown witnesses to the Paris text, the Saint-Jacques Bible at the Bibliothèque Nationale, does mark at 22:1, the way the Gutenberg Bible annotation said to. But most of the Paris Bibles, like the Munich copy of the Gutenberg Bible, mark it in this way, simile factum est. When the various shops of Mentelen in Strasbourg, of Pfister in Bamberg, of Fürstenschiffer in Mainz, and of Egestein in Strasbourg were setting their respective editions from different copies of the Gutenberg Bible, none of those copies had been rubricated yet, and so none of the compositors working on Matthew saw a chapter division where chapter 2 would begin. They simply set text continuously at this place, just as their exemplars did. Slide 14, please. So this is the 36-line Bible, the copy at the Scheide Library. You can see a later reader way over in the margin there wrote a little capitulum 22, and he treated it as simile factum est. But in the Fürstenschiffer shop, after the printing, but before the sheets were distributed for sale, this error of omission of a chapter 22 was noticed. The page containing the error was hand-corrected, or a combination of hand and type corrected, as you'll see. Chapter 22 being marked to 22:2, simile factum est again. The correction was carried out in 2 different ways. One, less elegantly for the paper sheets, slide 15. bodily copy. There, the last word of the line simile was partially scratched out, and that allowed a blank, a little roughened blank piece of blank of paper where the S as a versal letter could be written in red ink, thus not as a full two-line chapter initial. So it broke the hierarchy. It wasn't elegant, and the chapter number was written in the intercolumn, which is again a slight inelegance. Printed text on vellum can be carefully scraped and washed away without seriously damaging the surface. So for the vellum sheets, can we see the next slide, please? The entire final word simile was scraped away to make a place for the chapter number 22 to be written in. And then the following 4 lines of type were fully erased. 4 new lines were set, including a 2-line indentation to put in the initial. And those new lines were stamped or printed under the press in the correct position. Because these lines were not part of the original type page, they can often be seen to be very slightly skewed with respect to the lines above and below them, varying from copy to copy. A pale erased ghost of the original setting lies under them. So there are actually 2 strata at that point on that page of the Fusten-Schiffer Bible. William Scheide and Mina Bryan tracked the treatment of Matthew 22 in all 15th century Latin editions, and they arranged the treatments in columns. They found that the editions that made no demarcation of Matthew 22 died out rather quickly. Those early editions, set from the Gutenberg Bible, followed by 3 Basel editions dying out in the mid-1470s. A relatively small number of editions marked at Matthew 22:1 at Respondens Jesus, starting with the Basel edition of 1475, and all of Anton Koberger's many Nuremberg editions followed that. This column also includes 2 editions unconnected with the Gutenberg Bible, one printed in Piacenza in 1475, the other in Vicenza, 1476, both of which were set from independent manuscripts. So that's what their exemplar had as chaptering. But the major column is that with Matthew 22 marked at 22 verse 2, simile factum est, beginning with the 1462 Fusten-Schiffer Bible, continuing to Sweinheim and Panartz's 1471 Bible, from there to Franciscus Rener's 1475 Venice Bible, and onward to all other Venice and Basel Bibles, and then Bibles printed from other later shops in Naples, Lyon, Cologne, Strasbourg, Speyer, and Brescia. This is our strong hint that the long-term descent of the Gutenberg Bible's text, with whatever subsequent changes of readings in different places were made in later editions, was transmitted via the 1462 Bible. I have not seen a return to marking chapter 22 at 22:1 at Respondens Jesus until Robert Etienne's 1528 edition. Although it has not been discussed as such, the 1462 Bible, at places, consciously revised the Gutenberg Bible text on the basis of other sources or some other source. That is, beyond the textual profile of first and second settings in the copy or copies of the Gutenberg Bible used as exemplar, additional textual emendations were made. In his monograph, Der Text der Gutenberg Bible, Heinrich Schneider listed a half-dozen scattered places where the reading of the 1462 corrects the Gutenberg Bible, but he did not draw a general conclusion. The pathway toward a deepened picture of emendations in the Fusten-Schiffer Bible was laid by Gerhard Powitz in his 2009 study in the Gutenberg Jahrbuch, where he examined manuscript emendations in several copies of the Gutenberg Bible, including the Göttingen vellum copy, whose illuminations can be localized to Mainz. Powitz did not examine the vellum copy at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, some of whose illuminations are related to those of the Göttingen copy, and whose original owner was the Mainz Benedictine Convent of St. James the Great, one of the leading convents of the Bursfeld Reform. Well, that copy also contains a sizable number of emendations, often so carefully and neatly made by erasure on the vellum that they can be hard to spot. And there is a quite high but not invariable correlation between the emendations in the Göttingen and Paris copies, both originally in Mainz, owned in Mainz. Finally, when these places of emendation are tracked down in the printed text of the Fürstenschiffer 1462 Bible, we very frequently find that they were included also in that edition. Thus, notionally, beyond the original exemplars for the Gutenberg Bible, we further see in Mainz, a few years later, a kind of pool of corrections. And we must suppose that there was some individual or small group of individuals who applied corrections to two local copies of the Gutenberg Bible, the ones now in Göttingen and Paris, and also communicated them to Fürstenschiffer when a new Bible was being printed in 1463. So we have a triad of Bibles to study with regard to textual state. A good example among many is a place where the Gutenberg Bible's text was correct, and where the Göttingen copy and the Paris vellum copy and the Paris vellum copy from the convent of St. James, the Jakobsberg, and the Fürstenschiffer printed Bible all add an inauthentic interpolation. This is at Wisdom chapter 7, verse 9, where we see the setting of the Gutenberg Bible. That's slide 17, please. Last line is correct. Negante se videre marks the authentic end of that verse. The corrector of the Paris vellum copy, slide 18, please, added a clause in manuscript, which is not authentic, is not part of the Hebrew. It's not part of Jerome's translation. Well, no, I'm sorry. Sapientia was not translated by Jerome. Not part of the Greek text. So there it's added in manuscript, and the point of interpolation is shown. Then, slide 19, the Fürstenschiffer edition has the identical interpolation. The editors of the Rome Old Testament, the standard scholarly edition, record this interpolation in the Theodulfian recension of the Carolingian period, and then in the Paris Bible. So here again is a case where the Gutenberg Bible's text is correct and is not that of the Paris Bible. A copy of the Fürstenschiffer Bible was used as the exemplar for the Royal Folio printed by Sweinheim and Penarts in Rome, 1471. This Bible varied from the tradition of 15th century Bibles, both manuscript and printed, to a degree that can almost be considered eccentric. It was printed with the press's Antiqua or Roman font in long lines which do not make for comfortable reading. As preface was printed a humanist Latin translation of the Letter of Aristeas, a Jewish Hellenistic pseudepigraph, which recounts in detail a miraculous legend emphasizing the accuracy with which the Septuagint Pentateuch had been translated from the Hebrew. Apart from this humanist signal, Sweinheim and Penarts, or rather their literary editor, Gianandrea Bussi, consciously drew their edition closer to the tradition of the Paris Bible in several ways. First, apocryphal 4 Ezra was omitted, as it was never part of the Paris Bible tradition. Second, slide 20, please. Sweinheim and Penarts' edition added for the first time the supplementary index of Hebrew names, an alphabetical index with symbolic etymologizing of names that had been a standard feature of the Paris Bible. This index has recently been very revealingly studied by Eyal Poleg. In our sample group of 15th century manuscript Bibles, 30 codices include the interpretations and 45 lack it. But its reappearance in print in the Sweinheim and Penarts edition encouraged a revival, for it became a standard feature of most later printed Vulgate Bibles, continuing well into the third decade of the 16th century. Third, slide 21, please. Could you go back to slide 20 for a second? Yeah, I got the slides in the wrong order. Go to the next slide, please. We're going to back up. There is the index of Hebrew names. I could have sworn I put this in the right order. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the other feature of Swineham and Penart's. They added almost all of the standard Paris Bible prologues that were missing from the Gutenberg Bible and its immediate descendants, and particularly the large group attached to the 12 minor prophets. But also they added Paris Bible prologues to Chronicles, Wisdom, Matthew, and Apocalypse. The only omissions from the Paris group were the 2 Maccabees prefaces of Rabanus Maurus, which thereby dropped out of sight in all later pure text editions of the Vulgate Bible. So a Paris Bible, something very like it, must have been at hand when a copy of the Fust and Schiffer Bible was being prepared as setting copy in the Swineham and Penart's group shop. But if any significant editing of the text occurred in Rome, it has not so far been noticed. As an edited text, then, the first stage of the printed Latin Bible is the Gutenberg Bible, where signs of editing are especially strong in 4 Ezra. The second stage is the Fust and Schiffer Bible of 1462, with its emendations from what may be seen as a pool of variant readings gathered in Mainz, perhaps centered in the Jakobsburg convent, and entered also in the Paris and Göttingen copies of the Gutenberg Bible itself. The third stage, and essentially the last until Robert Etienne's Paris Bible of 1528, is the Bible printed in Venice 1475 by Franciscus Rener and Nicholas de Frankfordia. Can we see the next slide? Yes, and that's it. Unlike Swineham and Penart's Bible and all the Northern European Vulgate Bibles printed to date, this was a chancery, not royal folio, with leaf height of roughly 30 as against roughly 40 centimeters for a royal folio. Royal folio Bibles continued to be produced in Germany until 1480, but apart from these, starting in 1475, typical Latin Bibles were chancery folio in size. A few were median folio, one printed by Jensen. Eventually, they were printed in even smaller formats, as in Johann Froben's 1491 Basel Octavo Bible. Larger paper was used only for Bibles with surrounding commentaries of the Glossa Ordinaria, of Nicholas de Lyra, and of Hugh of St. Cher. Rener's 1475 Bible used the Swineham and Penart's 1471 edition as its exemplar, but made extensive changes in both contents and text. There needs to be a short side note here, for one good scholar has doubted this statement, which admittedly I first made in a rather offhand manner in an auction catalog description 30 plus years ago. He has suggested forcefully, but without citing any textual evidence, that Rener's Bible was set from a copy of the Fust and Schiffer Bible. To avoid seeming apodictic, let me review quickly reasons to believe that the Swineham and Penart's edition, not Fust and Schiffer, was the fundamental exemplar of the Rener Bible of 1475. In his 1922 memoir on the text of the Octateuch, Dom Henri Quentin's Collections showed already 3 places in Genesis and Numbers where Swineham and Penart's plus Rener shared readings against Fust and Schiffer. In 3 Regum, that is 1 Kings, chapter 3, the Gutenberg Bible and Fust and Schiffer both omit verse 23, which is restored both in Swineham and Penart's and in Rener. Psalm 17, verse 14, Fust and Schiffer follows the Gutenberg Bible in printing erroneously the verb introevit for intonuit. In both Swineham and Penart's and Rener, the verb is corrected. All of these create difficulties if we suppose the Rener edition to have been set from Fust and Schiffer, for we must hypothesize that Swineham and Penart's in 1471 and Rener in 1475 independently and coincidentally made identical textual corrections at each place. Still other passages can be cited where Swineheimen, Penarts, and Rener share readings that differ from Fürstenschiffer, and in every such case, the believer in Fürstenschiffer's Bible as the exemplar for Rener must once more and once more again appeal to coincidence. Moreover, in general, in many dozens of places where the spelling of proper names differs between Fürstenschiffer and Swineheimen Penarts, as they frequently do, Rener's orthography follows Swineheimen Penarts. And finally, it seems clear that the interpretations of Hebrew names in Rener's edition copies that of Swineheimen Penarts. Here the identity of orthography is especially persuasive. I believe we may accept that the Fürstenschiffer Bible is a child of the Gutenberg Bible, the Swineheimen Penarts Bible is a grandchild, and the Rener Bible is a great-grandchild. Rener's edition restored 4 Ezra, whose text could have been supplied from any of the Northern Vulgate editions descended from the Gutenberg Bible, not excluding the Fürstenschiffer Bible. For indeed, we know from localizable illuminations and early provenances that the 1462 Bible was marketed in Italy, as it was also in France, and for that matter, in England. As mentioned, Rener included the interpretations of Hebrew names, but not the letter of Aristeas. The letter of Aristeas appeared in just one more Bible. Though we know little in detail about the wider distribution of copies of Swineheimen Penarts' Bible, some copies were sold north of the Alps, as attested by the Bodleian copy of Volume 2 with its high-quality South German 2-color rubricated filigree initials, which we saw misplaced, and which makes me think that the version of the PowerPoint we're looking at is not the latest version, but we will continue. One copy reached Nuremberg, where the first printer of the city, Johann Zensenschmidt, used it as exemplar for a Latin Bible, completed the 9th of December, 1475, just 3 weeks after Coburger completed the first of his numerous Latin Bibles in the same city. Zensenschmidt copied the Swineheimen Penarts edition in full, including the letter of Aristeas and omitting 4 Ezra. His is a handsome book with headlines printed in Lombard capitals and with red-printed tituli. In Swineheimen Penarts' edition, they're black. And moreover, he printed his Bible on imperial paper, significantly larger than royal, with leaf height of a tall copy, measuring some 47 centimeters. Could we see slide 24? And that's the colophon and printer's devices of the Zensenschmidt edition. The colophon of Rener's edition contains no boasts, but it was an extensively edited production. The additional Paris Bible prologues of the Swineheimen Penarts editions were included with one noteworthy exception. But besides these, some 27 more prologues were supplied from older traditions. That is, none were recent compositions. The 12 minor prophets were almost buried within a matrix of 28 prologues and argumenta. One change of prologue within the minor prophets provides an earmark by which one can easily see how many subsequent Latin editions descended from Rener's Bible, which was the link in by far the longest descending chain from the Gutenberg Bible. In Swineheimen Penarts, the second prologue to Jonah is the traditional Paris one, numbered by Kerr as 32, beginning Jonas Columba. Could we see slide 25? Yes. Its source was Isidore's tract on the births and deaths of the Church Fathers. Rener's edition substituted for this a much briefer prologue, likewise beginning Jonas Columba, which is slightly modified from Jerome's summary of Jonah in his long letter to Paulinus of Nola, the lengthy letter which became in Alcuinic Bibles and then on into the Gutenberg Bible the preface to the whole Bible, prologue 1. Thus, by the first few words, we can immediately determine which prologue we have. Jonas Columba at Dolens, Isidore from the Paris tradition, or Jonas Columba Pulcherima, the most beautiful dove, who in his shipwreck foretold the sacrifice of Jesus. coming from Jerome. In fact, apart from that 1476 Zensenschmidt edition, the Paris prologue now disappears. Essentially, every succeeding edition uses the brief Jerome prologue of Rener's edition to the end of the 15th century and again well into the third decade of the 16th. The textual emendations in Rener's Bible are extensive, with many small corrections of textual errors. But the hidden, strong influence of Rener's edition on the Vulgate text, extending down to the Clementine Vulgate, is perhaps more vividly seen in its errors than in its corrections. This leads us back to the generalization with which we closed the first lecture, a generalization approved by the major scholars of the history of the Vulgate, that the Gutenberg Bible is in essence a descendant of the 13th century Paris Bible recension. In the second lecture, I argued against overconfidence in this formulation, not by putting forward a particular alternate hypothesis, but only by emphasizing that this generalization needs to be tested by considering the evidence that goes against it. In any scholarly investigation, if we agree that certain evidence agreeable to a hypothesis counts in its favor, we must acknowledge the possibility of evidence that is not agreeable to the hypothesis and therefore weakens it. And we must judge all evidence by an equal standard. If we play favorites, we close our minds. The Paris Bible recension was heavily criticized for its errors in the 1260s by the English Franciscan Roger Bacon, who in fact first asserted what we know from surviving Bibles to be the case, that there was in the 13th century such a concept as a Paris Bible, the exemplar parisiense, as he referred to it. In his Opus Maius, addressed to Pope Clement IV, Bacon gave an example of one such Paris error appearing at the end of Deuteronomy 27. This chapter ends with a series of maledictions to be proclaimed by the Levites, to each of which the assembled people are to call out Amen. One of the maledictions, verse 24, is against he who shall have struck down his neighbor in secret, qui clam percusserit proximum suum. And then the next authentic verse, 25, is against he who accepts a bribe to take an innocent life, qui accipit munera et percutiat animum sanguinis innocentis. Slide 26 should show you the correct reading in the Gutenberg Bible. In Paris Bibles, let's go to slide 27, a verse is interpolated between those. It's a curse against he who sleeps with his neighbor's wife, qui dormit cum uxure proximi sui. And you should see it the third line down, beginning with the word dormit. The Gutenberg Bible did not have that Paris interpolation, nor was it included in the Pfuston-Schiffer Bible, nor in the Swanheim and Panart's Bible, set from Pfuston-Schiffer. This interpolated verse first appears in Rener's edition, the anonymous editor emending from a manuscript Bible, let's see image 28, please, that had this Paris reading. As Bacon pointed out more than 750 years ago, this reading is indeed characteristic of the Paris Bible. It is present, for instance, in the manuscript we mentioned at the Mainz Stadtbibliothek, Handschrift 267, which Heinrich Schneider identified as having other readings significantly shared with the Gutenberg Bible in the Pentateuch portion. Among the sample group of 15th century manuscript Bibles, 46 of them have this Paris interpolation, do not sleep with your neighbor's wife, and 28 lack it, although in 2 of the latter it was added marginally by a second hand. In his Opus Minus, also addressed to Clement IV, Bacon noted another Paris corruption occurring at the end of chapter 8 of Mark, where Jesus challenges his disciples, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, then when he comes before the glory of the Father, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him." The operative words for this state of shame in Mark are confusus and confundetur. But in the Paris Bible, the operative words are rather confessus et confitebitur, giving what really is an opposite meaning. Whoever acknowledges me will be at his death acknowledged. Completely backwards. This textual corruption of confessus confitebatur is indeed an earmark of the Paris Bible. Could we see slide 29? It's the very end of the second line is con abbreviated, and then fessus starting third line, continuing from there. The corrupt Paris reading was brought into print by the 1475 Rener Bible. See the next slide, please. We are missing that slide. Go back one more, please, Charles. Yeah, I'm sorry. This was my PowerPoint confusion. Go to the next one, which is Gutenberg Bible, that same slide again. In the sample group of 15th century manuscripts, at Mark 838, this is a widespread error. 53 of the codices have incorrect confessus, and only 12 join the Gutenberg Bible and have incorrect confusus. The two incunable editions briefly mentioned already, set from Italian manuscripts, Piacenza, Vicenza, both have the incorrect Paris reading. And in fact, the misreading confessus also went to Middle English, for it is reflected in both of the Wycliffite versions. Bacon was particularly scornful of this error in the Paris Bible, for the passage was correctly cited by Augustine in his Contra Faustum, the Manichae. He next pointed out that the corresponding words of the Greek text clearly referred to shame. And finally, what he called a proba certissima. He noted that if the Eusebian canons had been consulted, readers would immediately have found the parallel passage in what we now identify as Luke 9:26, where the corresponding verb is erubescere, to blush, to feel shame, thus giving the lie to confiteor. But as he noticed, the Paris Bible had expunged the Eusebian canons from its text, so that useful tool was no longer available. But in this shiny copy of the Gutenberg Bible, you can see at the top there that the Eusebian canon numbers were written in by hand, giving the cross references to the parallel passages in Luke and Matthew. Bacon's treatment of this passage in the Paris Bible is a model of clear thinking, and we may easily believe that he would not have been favorably impressed by the editors of the Vulgate Bible in the printing shops of the later 15th and 16th centuries, who passed the error on faithfully from one edition to the next, dozens of times over for more than a century, frequently in editions whose colophons asserted that they had been diligentissime emendata, or other words to like effect. The distinctive Paris readings in Deuteronomy 27 and Mark 8, absent from the Gutenberg Bible, but entered into the printed tradition by an editor working for Rener in 1475, provide further evidence, although this is not a numbers game, that the characterization of the Gutenberg Bible as a direct descendant of the Paris Bible is at least oversimplified. The fact is, we do not have enough information to draw any valid picture of the varied paths of transmission of the Vulgate text in the 14th and 15th centuries. A first step might be to gather a much wider range of distinctive Paris Bible readings that would cover the books of both testaments. With a well-made checklist of, say, 100 such readings, we could, as a first step, score each manuscript Bible of the 14th and 15th century and consider whether plausible groupings begin to emerge. It is only with the appearance of the Gutenberg Bible that we find again solid ground for its text, taking into account the relatively small group of substantive variants between the first and second settings, provides a measuring rod for nearly all subsequent Latin Bibles up to the establishment of the Clementine Vulgate. Only 3 15th century printed Bibles, though one of these an edition of great importance, were set from manuscripts independently of the Gutenberg Bible. Two of these have been mentioned several times in passing. The first is the 1475 Chancery Quarto Bible, printed in Piacenza. Can we see slide 33? Yes. Intended to be a truly portable Bible. Printed in a minute but poorly made, scarcely legible type. Its order of text differs dramatically from that of the Paris Bible. For instance, with Psalms following 2 Chronicles, in the New Testament, the Catholic epistles and Acts both come after Apocalypse. Only about 15 copies survive, a surprising number of which have French provenances. The second is a 1476 Chancery Folio, printed in Vicenza by Leonardus Achates. Its manuscript source presumably lacked both 3 and 4 Ezra, for they are included in the Bible, but in the texts that follow the Gutenberg Bible tradition. Both of these editions, also Piacenza, show their distance from the Paris Bible in their setting of the Song of Songs. Can we see slide 34, please? They include the Christianizing rubrics that can be referred to as voces, that is, the allocation of different verses to the voice of Christ, voice of the church, voice of the spouse, etc. Ideally, the rubricator of this bodily copy would have underlined them in red, for they are paratext. And slide 35 is an Italian Bible showing the Song of Songs, the beautiful Albergati Bible, 1428. And there you see all of the red rubrics added to the Song of Songs. The third Latin Bible, whose text is independent of the Gutenberg Bible, is the so-called Rusch glossed Bible, a massive imperial folio of 1480, which was printed by Adolf Rusch in Strasbourg, but whose costs were primarily underwritten by Anton Koberger of Nuremberg. The edition must have been formed from multiple exemplars, gathered from a variety of 13th and very possibly also 12th century codices, assembled to produce setting copy for a complete Bible. Essentially nothing is known in detail about the Rusch Bible's exemplars, but a collation of almost any passage from any of its books will show that the copy source for the Bible text itself was not taken from the Gutenberg Bible tradition. Not that the text form is strikingly different, but rather that numerous small deviations, such as transpositions of words, of word order, are pervasive. On the other hand, 3 and 4 Ezra, which had no traditional glosses, were included in the Rusch Bible and drawn from the Gutenberg Bible tradition for the sake of completeness. Can we see the next slide? Yeah. A considerable number of Paris Bible readings appear also in the Rusch Bible text, which may reflect on the dates of its exemplars. That is, they may be more 13th century than 12th century. One of these is illustrated here from the beginning of Song of Songs, verse 7. If thou know not, O lovely among women, go and follow the path of the flocks. The Vulgate text has, O lovely among women, O pulcher inter mulieres. But in the Paris Bible, this is heightened to pulcherrima, O loveliest among women. And that's what we find in the Rusch glossed Bible. The late Mary Dove's edition of the glossed Song of Songs has pulcher based on the manuscripts she used, but her apparatus notices the Rusch Bible's variant of pulcherrima, which is a Paris Bible reading. At the two readings we just reviewed in some detail, that interpolation in Deuteronomy 27, the false reading confessus at the end of Mark 8, the Rusch Gloss Bible leaves out the Deuteronomy interpolation, but reads confessus and not confusus at Mark 8:38. This, however, is not to be seen as a reading necessarily introduced from the Paris Bible. Bibliothèque Nationale, Manuscript Latin 14408, is a mid-12th century glossed mark, part of a large group of early glossed books from the library of St. Victor of Paris, and it likewise reads confessus and Confitebatur. It seems likely that the reading of the early gloss texts of Mark subsequently entered the Paris Bible text in the 13th century. At this point, near the close of our final lecture, we take a long leap forward of more than a century and briefly reassert, but with some qualifying inflections, what has been said before, most notably by Dom Henri Quentin, early editor of the Rome Old Testament. A large number of readings of the Gutenberg Bible move on to and are embedded in the Sixtine Clementine official editions of the Roman Catholic Church of 1590 and 1592 and all subsequent reprints. The fundamental cause is that the base text, however corrected and modified by later editors, was always some earlier printed edition whose base text was another even earlier printed edition, and so forth back to the Gutenberg Bible. It is rather like the 18th century editors of Shakespeare. Nicholas Rowe used the 1685 fourth folio as the base text of his edition. Then Alexander Pope used Rowe's edition as his base text. Then Lewis Tybalt used Pope's edition as his base text. However much each editor changed the text and perhaps castigated the impercipience of his predecessor, fourth folio readings persisted through all. The qualification to be made, however, is that our equivalent foundation in the Sixtine Clementine editions is not the Gutenberg Bible, just as the Rowe, Pope, Tybalt Shakespeares did not have their foundation directly in the Shakespeare First Folio. Its foundation, rather, is a doubly amended recension of the Gutenberg Bible. The first group of emendations was made in the shop of Fust and Schuffer in 1462, drawing on what we have referred to as a pool of Mainz variance readings. As noted, the basis may have been corrections made at the Benedictine convent of the Jakobsberg, for the Fust and Schuffer emendations show a high but not complete correlation with hand corrections entered in that convent's vellum copy. Then a second round of emendations, extensive but still not yet fully defined, was made at the printing shop of Franciscus Rener and Nicholas de Frankfordia in Venice in 1475, and it is the text of this edition that spread so widely from one edition to another to the end of the 15th century and far beyond. A well-rounded account of the transmission of the Vulgate text in the 16th century down to the 16 Clementine editions would require a 6th lecture, perhaps even a 7th lecture, which you will not get. One of the most important chapters in the 16th century history of the text has never been investigated with anything like the fullness it deserves, namely the successive editions of Robert Etienne. The Rome Old Testament scholarly edition regularly gives the readings of Etienne's 1532 and 1540 editions in its apparatus. But Etienne's work on the Latin text cannot be understood without studying side by side all three major editions, 1528, 1532, and 1540. Moreover, the Rome Old Testament apparatus not infrequently records an unfavored reading from Etienne without remark. Can we see the next slide, 37? Yes. Look at the third line down. You see the word amen, and you see the little mark after it. Etienne marked readings with special symbols to indicate that they were dubious, such as Latin interpolations in Old Testament books that had no Hebrew equivalent. And this is that same interpolation at Deuteronomy 27:24, where Etienne put a little long line in front of it and two dots after it. And that was his way of saying that it isn't really authentic, but he's putting it there because it's part of the tradition, but his own knowledge tells him it shouldn't be there. And so in the apparatus of the Rome Old Testament, they really should have indicated when Etienne made an editorial remark. They should have had a way of distinguishing between that. Aetien's engagement with the Latin Bible text can in fact only be studied from his physical editions and not from the textual apparatus of either the Rome Old Testament or of the Oxford New Testament, the latter citing only the 1546 reprint of his 1540 Royal edition. See the next slide, please. We'll look briefly at two early 16th century editions to confirm that the influence of the Rener text was wide-ranging. The first of these is the famous Complutensian Polyglot, the great multilingual Bible printed at great cost at Alcalá de Henares between 1513 and 1517, under the patronage of Cardinal Cisneros, Archbishop of Toledo, sometime regent of Spain. Among the manuscripts in various languages assembled for consultation on the project were two major 10th century Bibles in Visigothic script, referred to as Complutensis I and II. It has repeatedly been stated that these ancient manuscripts were used in establishing the Vulgate text printed in the polyglot, which thereby was improved beyond the then current standard. There is no evidence for this, and it can be said with some confidence that for its Latin text, the Complutensian edition simply copied from one of any number of printed Vulgate Bibles of the Rener kind. A dozen or more editions would have been available in the early 16th century, all of this type. We see this at the passage we have examined in other editions, Mark 8:38. Do you see the word confessus? It's the 8th line down, and it starts me confessus fuerit. And in front of confessus is a little superscript M. That superscript M is to match it up with the corresponding Greek word in column A. Well, that Greek word in column A, which has the M, is epaiskinthe, ashamed. And so they match them up, but they have opposite meanings. There was no thinking whatever, no correspondence whatever in terms of a mental process. They just put the superscripts in and kept on going. And there was a similar dissonance later on at Confitebatur. The compositor set the Latin text from a random printed Vulgate Bible without any regard to the Greek. Those fine ancient manuscripts never come into the picture at all. The second edition to look at briefly, go see the next slide. Yes. Is a quarto Bible published by Giunta in Venice in 1511, edited by a Venetian Dominican, Alberto Castellano. It was mentioned briefly by Quentin in his 1922 memoir as the first printed edition to include variant readings. And indeed, these variants are advertised on the title page of the book. It says, with the addition in the margin of diverse variant texts. An excellent recent study by Tunis van Lopik has made a detailed analysis of Castellano's sources for the variant readings he has added, showing that he made extensive use of the printed editions of the massive Pastilla of Hugh of St. Cher and also of the Glossa Ordinaria. And here too we may consider the treatment of Mark 8:38, and it's at the very top there, qui anim me, and then a kind of a Maltese cross, confessus, and then in the margin is alias, found elsewhere, confusus. So marked out. No preference is indicated. It should be noted that in the early 14th century, in his widely read Pastilla on the Gospels, Nicholas de Lyre had already identified confessus and confitebatur as corrupt readings. Like Roger Bacon, he pointed to both the Greek text and the parallel passage in Luke where the verb erubescere was used. The basis of Castellano's edition was a Rener-derived edition, for it shows the characteristic Rener earmark in the second prologue to Jonah, that short prologue, which is not the Paris Bible prologue. Let us conclude, and let's go to the final slide. Good. One very small place, 2 words only, where we can say with some confidence that the Gutenberg Bible Workshop invented text that has now become part of the standard modern edition of the Vulgate Bible. 2 words that before the Gutenberg Bible was set in type had no place at all in the Vulgate Bible tradition. This insertion occurs in 4 Ezra at what by modern numbering is chapter 7, verse 113. At this place in the Saint-Germain manuscript, the source of all later 4 Ezra texts, there is a statement that the day of judgment will be the end of present time, and then the immediately following words after that, futuri immortalis temporis, seem to be somewhat untethered syntactically. The 19th century Cambridge editor, Robert Bensley, found these following words preceded by et initium in the 1592 Clementine edition, producing a smooth reading. So we have the day of judgment will be the end of this time and the beginning, et initium, of immortal time to come. He did not find those words et initium in any of the manuscripts he had seen, and he suggested that the words may have been added in the early years of printing. His instincts were very good. Having consulted many more late manuscripts of 4 Ezra than Bensley saw, we can confirm that the words et initium are, to the best of our knowledge, absent from the 4 Ezra manuscript tradition. The modern edition of the Latin Bible, which you see below, known as the Stuttgart Vulgate, a revised re-edition of the Rome Old Testament and the Oxford New Testament, retains et initium in its 4 Ezra, and it's sourced in its apparatus to the Clementine Vulgate. But the Clementine Vulgate inherited those words from the Gutenberg Bible. Here it is reasonable to think that an unknown editor in Mainz in the early 1450s, preparing 4 Ezra for composition by removing the reference to Ezra at the beginning of chapter 3, making other scattered small changes, again not in the manuscript tradition, and imposing a new 16-chapter structure on the text, which it never had before, here neatened the passage in question by adding in initium, and so made an original but very late contribution to what we call the Vulgate Bible more than 1,000 years after the death of Jerome. Thank you.